Norma, you're a legend.
Yes.
So happy to meet you. Thank you so much for having us in your home. My name is Oona Chaplin.
Happy to meet you.
Norma Barzman. She was 22 when she first moved to Hollywood. When I met her, she was 101 years old.
I came out here when I was very young, and I was a newspaper reporter to begin with.
She was a journalist and writer, and she was also a Hollywood communist. Norma had friends in common with the screenwriter Dalton Trumbo. They knew the same people, and the two families socialized together. She came to town when Hollywood's legends were being forged.
On the Los Angeles Examiner, a Hearst paper.
Hearst was William Randolph Hearst, publishing magnate and politician, one of the people that the movie Citizen Kane was modeled on.
And I did something that amused Hearst, and then Hearst sent his car for me. And I went up to Hearst Castle.
Wow.
And met Marion and him, and they insisted I swim in their pool. And they were very nice. They were okay. And but I didn't stay long on the newspaper. I did that for a couple of years.
Imagine this girl in her 20s lunching with one of the most powerful figures in town. And this is LA after all, so pretty soon her talents would lead her to show business. She lands work as a screenwriter.
Our friends were many actors and so forth.
What was Hollywood like when you first started coming around here?
One of the first things you do when you come to Hollywood in those days was get yourself an agent. I frequently came up with the idea and then went to work on my own idea. They put me to work, paid me a salary.
But it felt very creative here.
Yes, it felt creative.
Yeah.
You might go to a party and you hear someone say something that gives you an idea.
Yeah.
And you develop it yourself. Then you talk to a friend about it, and suddenly the two of you were collaborating on a screenplay.
But politics were also a big part of Norma's life in Hollywood, and she and her friends leaned left.
The ones I cared about were progressive. Well, I use the word progressive. Doesn't mean that they joined the Communist Party, but it means that they supported all the progressive causes.
I want to know about why the Communist Party? What drew you to it?
In those days, if you were an A student, you were probably, I mean, if you were very bright, you probably were progressive.
Yeah.
Being a communist was not, they made it into something terrible, but it was like being a progressive person, believing in progressive things.
Norma joined the Communist Party of the United States in 1943. In her autobiography, she writes about a conversation with Ben Barzman, a prominent screenwriter, the man that would soon become her husband. And she asked him about his membership of the Communist Party, and here's what he said. "I grew up during the Depression. Communists led the struggles for the unemployed. They unionized workers. They fought against injustice wherever it existed. The American Communist Party is not revolutionary. Nobody wants to overthrow the government with force or violence. It's just the best, most organized way that I know to fight fascism and to aid the colonial peoples in their struggle for freedom."
So many of our film friends, screenwriters, actors who are either members of the party or not members of the Communist Party, but went to meetings. And there was a really large segment of Hollywood who really cared about fighting for progressive rights, yes.
This blurred line between progressivism and communism would become increasingly problematic. Communism was becoming a dirty word in America, and forces were gathering to purge the red influence in Hollywood. Getting on the wrong side of those forces would cost some artists their careers. A battle for the political soul of America was raging, and the battlefield was Hollywood. From the BBC World Service and CBC podcasts, I'm Oona Chaplin, and this is Hollywood Exiles. Episode 4, Hearts and Minds. It's hard to know just how much of Norma Barzman's politics found its way into her scripts, like the one she wrote for the movie The Locket, directed by John Brahm for RKO Pictures.
Lovely is a dull word for Nancy. She seemed so perfect, it was alarming. And despite my psychiatric training, I was unable to detect the slightest flaw in her.
Probably not a lot. Critics describe it as a Freudian melodrama, so maybe not the best vehicle for ideology. And besides, the studios were allergic to politics. They didn't want to alienate potential ticket buyers with the wrong political message. It's true that with the arrival of talking pictures, writers became the creative engines of Hollywood filmmaking, and some of them, like Norma Barzman and Dalton Trumbo, had very strong political beliefs. But the real power remained in the hands of the studio bosses. They decided what scripts got produced and on what terms. With so little power in Hollywood's system, the writers decided they needed a collective voice, a means of bargaining. They formed the Screenwriters Guild. The movie bosses didn't much like that.
The studio heads thought that this was an effort to take control of screen content.
Larry Sapler is the author of Anti-Communism in 20th Century America.
So from the very beginning, the Screenwriters Guild was perceived as this radical writers' organization that had to be prevented from getting a formal position at all costs.
And for a while, the studios succeeded, but everything changed in 1935.
The National Labor Relations Act is now the law of the land. We shall see the dawn of a new era of peace and justice for all in our economic life.
A new law gave power to workers, making collective bargaining possible. It was seen as removing power from private companies and was greeted with alarm by business interests.
Says the Oklahoma Manufacturers Association, the NLRB will out-Stalin Stalin, out-Soviet the Russian Soviets.
For the most part, the Screenwriters Guild was after pretty modest gains, things like overtime pay, bathroom breaks, and safer working conditions. But this was a politically volatile time. The economy was dreadful and inequality was extreme.
As the Depression worsened, many of the people who were in the Guild began to question the capitalist economy, began to look at Russia as a kind of a place where to them was kind of a worker's paradise.
And some Guild members started to look at issues beyond the shop floor, issues like racial justice and civil rights and anti-fascism. And some writers, like Norma Barzman, started to consider more radical options. While the Writers Guild was something of a hotbed for leftist politics, it didn't speak for all screenwriters by any stretch.
I say that man is entitled to his own happiness and that he must achieve it himself, but that he cannot demand that others give up their lives to make him happy.
Ayn Rand was in the middle of the Hollywood writer scene at the time, and she absolutely hated communism.
Nor should he wish to sacrifice himself for the happiness of others.
Rand talking to interviewer Mike Wallace on ABC television. These days, Rand is best known for her novels, Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, which have become touchstones for libertarian political philosophy. For Rand, the individual is everything, and anything that inhibits the free expression of liberty and the pursuit of self-interest is tyranny. Her loathing of communism was rooted in her first-hand experience of the revolution.
She was born in St. Petersburg, grew up in St. Petersburg, Russia.
Harry Binswanger is a board member of the Ayn Rand Institute. He was also a personal friend of Rand in her later years.
And when the communists took over, she witnessed the first shots of I think it was the November Revolution, from her apartment window. They took place in the square that her apartment window overlooked in St. Petersburg. And she had a very hard time there. They were in starvation conditions, her family. And she knew she had to get out because she wanted to write, and she couldn't write under the rule of the Soviets.
Rand fled to the U.S. with the dream of becoming a screenwriter. One of her relatives in Chicago who owned a theater arranged an introduction to one of the studios. A few months after arriving from Russia, at the age of 21, Ayn Rand is in Hollywood.
And their first day on the lot in Culver City, she sees Cecil B. DeMille driving by in a roadster, an open roadster.
DeMille was an actor and director from Hollywood's golden age.
And she knew who he was from the movies that they allowed into Russia. And she stared at him. She stared so intently, she had these big black eyes, that DeMille stopped the car and said, "Why are you staring at me?" And she said, "I've just come from Russia and I'm delighted to see you." So he said, "Hop in, I'm going to my studio," because she said she wanted to work in the movies.
Just like that, Ayn had cracked the movie industry.
So it was like a fantasy that you wouldn't believe. She comes to America, and 6 months later, she's in Hollywood, and the second day that she arrives, she's riding with Cecil B. DeMille.
Ayn Rand's Hollywood dream life just kept getting better. She was hired by DeMille as a junior screenwriter. Afterwards, she moved on to write her own successful plays and novels, moving away from Hollywood. By the 1940s, Ayn Rand was as much an activist as an artist. But when she sold the movie rights to her bestseller, The Fountainhead, Warner Brothers hired her to write the screenplay, and she was back in the Hollywood fold once again. What she found horrified her. She saw the specter of communism lurking in the writers' rooms and studios and in the movies themselves. According to Larry Sapler, this wasn't just paranoia.
The older writers who came, who were members of the party, thought, okay, there's not much we can really do here. So what we should really do is organize outside of the studios. But a whole younger cohort that came out, say, around 1936, 37, thought they could change the movies, thought they could find a way to be creative and put their ideas into the scripts.
These younger writers wanted to put social justice issues up front.
They thought they could make a plea for democratic politics, try to treat Black people in a more humane, dignified manner, combat anti-Semitism, improve the status of women, things of that nature, what we would call progressive ideas.
And this wasn't just idealistic young writers trying to inject a social conscience into movies. The Communist Party was trying to pull strings as well.
The party in Hollywood created a script consulting committee. And you didn't have to submit your script to them, but if you did, you could be subject to all manner of questionable comments on it, dogmatic ones. Well, this isn't what the party wants you to do, or Sometimes good ones, sometimes scripts were improved, but generally people thought that was an example of too much party control.
There's no evidence that the Communist members' script consulting committee had much success. On the contrary.
The producers had complete control over what went on the screen. None of the Reds had a position of authority in the studios. There was no way that they could control hiring and firing or script writing or movie production.
Studios believed audiences went to the movies to be entertained, to escape their real life. And this was as much a business decision as a political one. Even Dalton Trumbo tended to shy away from political scripts. He understood the trade-off.
There is no one connected with film who is not in some way censored, self-censored, influenced, damaged in one way or other by money.
But even the risk of losing a paycheck wasn't enough to deter some of Trumbo's bolder colleagues. Ring Lardner Jr. was a friend of Trumbo's, and he was also a communist. He wrote a script for a film called Woman of the Year, directed by George Stevens for Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer.
It was a quick wedding, so the bride could get back to her career.
No one will ever believe we were married sober.
The movie stars icons Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn.
Where she is, for almost the entire movie, this really strong professional writer, who demands to have her own way and not to be under the thumb of Spencer Tracy.
And at the end of the movie, Ring Lardner, the writer, wanted to have Hepburn maintain her position, a strong, independent woman.
But the studio made them write an ending where she tries to become a good housewife.
What would you think about having a child?
Did you think I'd have to be sold on the idea?
Well, I wasn't quite sure. I thought perhaps I'd better get you into the right frame of mind.
Get me into me? Well, the sooner the better.
It's already been done.
Against the wishes of the writer, and indeed Katharine Hepburn, the star, the studio changed the ending of the film. The studio won. Ayn Rand acknowledged that by the time she returned to Hollywood in 1943, Warner Brothers had changed.
And she wrote that Warner Brothers had actually gotten rid of all their Reds, and the ones who were pink and who were left were not well known. She didn't know, who there might be that was moderate, but that they had, the card-carrying communists, they had actually fired. But the other studios were very timid about it. So I think she stiffened their backbone a little, but basically they were compromisers.
Rand believed that those timid studio bosses could use a little more backbone stiffening. She soon found allies in the cause.
She made the acquaintance of several conservatives in Hollywood, and the more intelligent and articulate and intellectual of them wanted to do something about, this was what's called over here the Red Decade.
Some of those allies come together to form something called the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals. Rand's old boss, Cecil B. DeMille, was a founding member, and so were John Wayne and Gary Cooper. Gossip columnist Hedda Hopper was leading the charge. Remember, she had helped keep Charlie Chaplin's legal troubles with Joan Barry in the headlines.
Next to the approbation of my own mind, the approbation of my fellow citizens is dear to my heart. In a free country, such approbation should be a citizen's reward, but the reverse is often the case.
Her stock in trade was insider dirt about Hollywood's power players, but her columns and broadcasts were sprinkled with strident expressions of patriotism, nativism, and anti-communism.
Tonight, let's pray for a rebirth in today's leadership of the great spirit of Washington, the spirit that puts country above self-interest, that puts duty ahead of just pleasing people. Let's keep our faith in the...
She was very suspicious, even hateful, of just about anything foreign.
There's nothing wrong with the picture, says Binford. The censorship is against Chaplin, an enemy of godliness in all forms.
The Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals wisely shortened its name to the Motion Picture Alliance. And the MPA fought communist influence very publicly, with rallies and pamphlets and its own publication, The Vigil. But Hopper and her MPA associates applied pressure behind the scenes as well. They threatened name and shame campaigns against projects that offended them. For the likes of Hopper and Rand and their ally J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI, subversive messages lurked in the movies, but it was sometimes difficult to detect. Rand claimed that crafty leftists were hiding their ideology in plain sight.
She had a very intellectual view of what was going on in movies. She thought that art was the indispensable medium for communicating a moral ideal. That's practically a direct quote from one of her articles on art. She said it shouldn't be propaganda, but it does have a tremendous impact.
Rand wrote a pamphlet for the MPA called Screen Guide for Americans, and in it, she wrote,
The purpose of the communists in Hollywood is not the production of political movies openly advocating communism. Their purpose is to corrupt our moral premises by corrupting non-political movies, by introducing small, casual bits of propaganda into innocent stories, thus making people absorb the basic principles of collectivism by indirection and implication.
And so, the Motion Picture Alliance went looking for evidence of subversive moral ideals in unlikely places.
And all because a few starry-eyed dreamers like Peter Bailey stir 'em up and fill their head with a lot of impossible ideas. Now, I say...
Just a minute. Now, hold on, Mr. Potter. You're right.
It's a Wonderful Life is a classic American movie.
Tony Shaw is the author of Hollywood's Cold War.
It's become a really, really popular movie.
Every Christmas.
Every Christmas. It's part of American culture.
We have enough money to send Harry to school, let alone me, but he did help a few people get out of your slums, Mr. Potter. And what's wrong with that?
For fans of the movie, It's a Wonderful Life is quintessentially American. It's about family and loyalty and sacrifice, about small-town values and people pitching in to help each other out. But the MPA saw something much more sinister.
The film shows Jimmy Stewart's George Bailey, a guy who runs a small bank, facing off against a much bigger banker, Potter, there, with George Bailey standing up for his ability to give loans to the common man. And the FBI thought that this was, proto-socialist, proto-communist because of its criticisms of banking. The guy who made it, directed it, is Frank Capra. Frank Capra was by no means on the political left.
There's a bunch of steps that need to be made that are all assumptions in order to take the film and then categorize it as subversive and dangerous, right?
It had criteria for what it deemed to be subversive or communist. And ultimately, it was anything that was either pro-leftist or anti-capitalist or anti-democracy or anti-American. But they're so vague are these terms that could mean virtually anything.
FBI agents worked closely with Rand and Hopper and the Motion Picture Alliance, and they came up with 3 categories to classify a movie as subversive. Category 1, that so-called American values are smeared or represented as evil. Category 2, that anti-American values are glorified. Or Category 3, casual references to current events that either belittle American political institutions or promote the Communist Party line. Because the Potter character in It's a Wonderful Life was a banker, an embodiment of capitalism, a supposed American value, smearing him was a Category 1 violation. Interestingly, the FBI's critique of the movie begins, though, with something far more tangible, a summary of the political affiliations of the people who worked on the film, and in the case of It's a Wonderful Life,
We do know that some leftists did have a hand in the making of the film. Dalton Trumbo had a hand in early scripting of the film. It just shows how scared, perhaps, the FBI was about what film might be doing to the American people.
We don't know for certain what Ayn Rand thought about the film. Her friend Harry Binswanger has a hunch.
I'm sure she would have hated It's a Wonderful Life. I do.
Although he was likely unaware of the full extent of what they were up to, Dalton Trumbo felt affronted by the work of the Motion Picture Alliance. He could see the mood in the country was shifting, and he could see that there were those capitalizing on it. In his anger, Trumbo penned a detailed criticism of the Alliance, their ideology, and their tactics. In particular, he highlighted the group's failure to name even one subversive film. If they fail to name pictures, he wrote, as they previously have failed, they are naked. The truth was that the FBI struggled to pin down alleged subversion in the films. It's not as though George Bailey was calling for a socialist revolution in Bedford Falls. He just wanted a fair share. And actually, even J. Edgar Hoover wasn't satisfied with the vagueness of these critiques. He wanted firm evidence. He needed firm evidence because he had much bigger plans. Coming up on Hollywood Exiles, J. Edgar Hoover gets a very public boost for his campaign from an unlikely ally.
So he goes to confession. The priest's name was Father McCoy, as I recall. And so my dad was pouring out his heart, and there's this moment of silence. And the priest says, "Oh, God, get those bastards, Billy."
Hello, I'm Glyn Tansley, one of the producers of Hollywood Exiles. Norma Barzman passed away in December 2023. She was 103 years old and remained an advocate and campaigner for the issues she believed in throughout her life. We're so grateful that she was able to share her story with us.
Hollywood Exiles is a production of BBC Audio Wales for the BBC World Service and CBC Podcasts. I'm Oona Chaplin. Ayn Rand was voiced by Diana Quick. The National Labor Relations Act archive is from the 1965 ABC television program Labor Comes of Age. Our producers are Glyn Tansley and Megan Jones. Music by Phil Channel and sound design by Kathy Robinson and Phil Channel. Our theme is by Nick Thorburn. Executive producer for BBC Audio is Martin Smith. At the BBC World Service, Prabjit Bains is senior producer and John Manel is the podcast commissioning editor. At CBC Podcasts, Jeff Turner is senior producer. Chris Oak is executive producer, and Arif Noorani is the director. Thank you for listening.